Looks like Heather is recording the session. Thank you, Heather. Welcome, everybody, to Polarity Management Revisited. Thank you, Michael, for doing a part two. I know it's a highly anticipated session. So today I'll be hanging out, and if you need anything, if you're having trouble with Zoom or accessing any of the resources, you can direct message me on the chat, or if it's a question for everybody, you can direct message everybody or send it to the group. We've asked that people, when you come in, that you just mute yourself, and then there'll be times when we're discussing and talking. So of course, unmute yourself then. Hey, Bobby, welcome. I'll paste it one more time. We ask that people go to the learning platform and download the Polarity Management map. So we'll be using that map as an activity. You'll be able to download it, and it's a PowerPoint, excuse me. You'll be able to type inside of it. With that, I will hand it off. We are recording, so just FYI, so people know. So folks can watch it later. And with that, I will hand it off to Michael, and we'll do introductions for everybody too.
All right, cool. Well, I'm thrilled to be back with you guys today, talking about this, and yeah, really excited. This will really be kind of a working session. So we'll do a little bit of a recap of some of what we covered, and then really spend most of the time kind of guiding you through like how to plan to manage one of these polarities or tensions. So why don't we, I'd love to maybe with introductions, name, organization. One of my colleagues is joining us as well, and glad to have her here with us. So we can do name, organization. I'm also interested in kind of what about polarities is interesting to you, or what you would like to learn more about, or a question you have, or any of that kind of stuff as part of the introductions, just so we get a little bit of flavor for what more you'd like to know. So, anyone want to go first? Wilson, you're on twice. That is amazing.
Yeah,
Wilson,
I lost you guys. I don't see anyone but you and me now. Anyway, awesome to see you guys and hear your voices when they're spoken. I remember really liking the spirit and just how different, I guess, this topic was. I never really heard about it. I mean, it resonated pieces of it, but I wanted to hear more. And then out of the things that I needed to select before I graduate, this seemed the most interesting to me. So that's why I signed up. And, Michael, you're always just a great speaker and really engaging. So
thank you.
Just go with the person.
All right, cool. And also, Wilson, can you give us preferred pronouns? I've got to ask that.
Oh, he, him.
Okay.
Hi, I'll jump in next. A moment of quiet. I'm Jen Gazzano. I am the Senior Director of Partnerships and Strategy at the Participatory Budgeting Project. New title as of yesterday.
Congrats.
Thanks. Working at home in my home kitchen at the moment. So I'm just really interested in this because a lot of the work that I'm doing sort of toes the line of kind of within the realm of progressive politics, and kind of the polarity that I'm playing with right now in my strategic initiative. Democracy Beyond Elections is the name of the initiative, is kind of this play of like how to be relevant without being like dangerously partisan, I suppose, and just playing with that in terms of thinking about who we're building alliances with.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Oh, hey, Michael. Hey, everybody. I'm Bobby with Willamette Partnership here in Oregon.
All right. Bobby, so preferred pronouns, what interests you about the topic or what's most interesting?
Yeah, he, him, his are my preferred pronouns, and interested in the topic just in terms of how you bring other people into a space to talk about polarity. So having a lot of great conversations across early childhood education, healthcare, environment, and in parts of rural Oregon the last couple of weeks, and just being able to hold the tensions that Portland and Eastern Oregon are never going to quite see eye to eye, and that's cool. How do
Yeah,
we just sit with that?
nice. Okay, great. Kent, Mari.
Hi, this is Kent. How are you?
Hey, good.
He, him, and his. I am at the School of Medicine at Michigan State University in the Division of Public Health, but I'm also executive director of a CBO. And so because of the work that I'm doing around the Flint water crisis, and more recently have been reaching out to Newark, New Jersey, who's currently having a water crisis with lead in the water crisis. I'm looking at similar to what Bobby was saying, because these are two polarized communities and the events has a lot of polarity embedded within them. And so really how to really bring people together to kind of have a dialogue around this topic, and then how can we use tools and skills to kind of have discussion and agree to disagree, but at least have discussion so that people understand where each other stands. And I think that that's very critical right now for me.
Awesome. I'm so fired up to be talking to you guys, because you guys are, this context you're describing are the perfect context for polarity thinking, right? When there's things that can really pull us apart, there are really strong differences. Like that's when this is best. All right, cool. Marin, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Marin Burton, she, hers. I am obsessed with polarity thinking. So I get an opportunity as a result of our work to teach polarity thinking across the country. I was just teaching to about 85 nonprofit leaders last Thursday in the Chicago area. And I'm just on the line to support. If there are enough people for breakout rooms, I might be supporting in a breakout room, but otherwise I'll just be listening and learning and here to support. Thanks.
All right, cool. Well, let's get started. Some people will be listening to this virtually, and so just to go over the format, I'm going to give a quick recap of some of the key things we talked about, and then we'll just have a couple rounds of me introducing parts of the tool, the polarity map. So Triana put a link in the chat where you could go in and grab the PowerPoint version of the map and just type right into it. You could use a blank sheet of paper and just draw the map. However you want to do it, but that's basically what we'll spend my goal is by the end, we have around one tension that you care about. You've had time to kind of work around all the different parts of the map. Now, Ken, you and Bobby both mentioned, well, all of you actually mentioned some aspect of using polarity thinking with communities, right, as part of a bigger process. So we'll go through this individually. In some ways, we're kind of simulating what ideally you could do with a group or a team or any group of people. So we'll treat this as an individual exercise, but it's just the exact same process that you could set up and facilitate with others going through and creating a map. So that you can think about on both those levels. All right, let me just see if there's any other preamble I needed to say. Okay, so let me share my screen and take you through a little bit of reminders. So we teed this up with this idea of how do you use resistance to achieve challenging goals. To me, that's where this shines best, as we said before. So this is the map I was talking about that we'll fill out. So you don't need to know this. We didn't spend a lot of time in New Orleans talking about the map, but the map is really the tool that we use to manage those tensions. So we'll actually go through each step, each part of this. You'll have a chance to work on it with a tension that you care about. and fill this in. And ideally, to the question of the group process, this is something that you would do with a group, where together you're kind of filling out this tool. And then this tool becomes something that's a living document, right? That you can refer back to when times get challenging, and say, well, these were the things we committed to, and these are the things that we're after. So, just as a reminder of the definition, we're talking about 2 points of view that are absolutely true, and part of a pair of truths that need each other over time. So we're not necessarily talking about like a good thing and a bad thing. It's two good things, two competing good things. So being direct and being diplomatic, right? Both of those things matter. They're both good on their own. So that'll be the one check we'll want to take for whatever you choose to use to go through this, that the two things are really both good, that they're both things that people would want and have benefit. I love this image for polarity thinking, that, some of the context, Jen, that you were talking about, and, you're dealing with a situation like this, where depending on where you sit, it might look different, but maybe if we think about it as a square, it's going to lead us down a path. If we think about it as a circle, if we can see the cylinder, and polarity thinking helps us to see, oh, maybe this is the cylinder, and both things are true at the same time. We've talked about polarity as an energy system that has a predictable flow. So back to the kind of being diplomatic and being direct. If I overdo being direct, it's predictable what's going to happen. Right? I don't know exactly when, I don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but it's predictable that if I'm overly blunt, there's some predictable downsides. If I'm overly diplomatic to the neglect of being direct, it's predictable what's going to happen. I may not know exactly when, exactly what it's going to look like, but I know where that leads. So we're trying to learn to see the energy systems. We're trying to learn to see how do these two good things play together, and what happens, what's this predictable nature if I overdo this to the neglect of that. It's unavoidable, indestructible, unstoppable, right? The tension between diplomacy and directness is not going away. We never can check it and say, oh, I'm good with that. It's always at play, and it changes as we're in different relationships. Even in the same relationship over time, it can change. The other thing I like to say is that it's free. Now, some of the things you have to do are not necessarily free, right? To get the upsides of some part of attention. But doing this better, leveraging tensions better, is something that inherently isn't about cost. It's about attention. It's about what we're paying attention to, and how our ability to perceive that there may be multiple truths available at the same time. Multiple truths that are both coexisting. Just a recap of one. So activity and rest. We'll just run through and we'll see all steps of what we're going to do today through this simple example. So we looked at activity and rest, right? Both great things. Say, well, if we fill in the first part of this map, let's just say the goal was to run a marathon, and that's the greater purpose up top you see there. And then the deeper fear is can't run the marathon. So if we're going to run a marathon, we need to leverage this tension. Sorry, going the wrong way. So the greater purpose. See there, the upsides and downsides. So the upside of activity, right, is increased endurance. So I want to practice, I need to build up, start with half a mile and build up my capacity. And the upside of rest is the muscles are built. So you guys know that muscles aren't built when you exercise, when you rest. If I overdo activity to the neglect of rest, I can have injury, right? Totally predictable if I overdo it. If I overdo rest to the neglect of activity, it says muscle atrophy. Really, maybe I can't finish the race, right? Maybe I can't even compete in the marathon. So this is totally predictable. Like we said, indestructible, moves around. But we take that and we actually then build out in the polarity map action steps and early warning signs. So in this example, an action step I might take to get the upsides of activity is to run farther each workout day. So I start with half a mile and I build up to wherever I'm going to get as close to the marathon. And then on the rest side, having adequate downtime between workout days. So now I can start to actually see, how am I going to manage this tension? Then the other part of this map are early warning signs. So With early warning signs, we're trying to think about how do we know if we've gone too far? So if I overdo activity to the neglect of rest, in this example, I might be too sore to work out, right? I might have some slight injury. It might be start to miss my schedule because I have an injury or am I pushing my body too hard? Not listening to my body might be another early warning sign. On the rest side, if I'm overdoing the rest, I might be too busy to work out, right? Quote unquote, right? I might be skipping workouts. That might be an early warning sign that, hey, if I'm going to be ready for a marathon, I'm not on track. So this is essentially just a simple example of the tool that we'll build that really allows us to manage, and not just this is an individual example, but you could see with the group, back to some of the context that you mentioned, getting clear about the actions we're going to take to achieve both is the management part. The part to me that releases the resistance is the early warning signs. The early warning signs help us to say that no one really wants these downsides. Like if you're training for a marathon, no one wants to get injured and no one wants to not be able to complete the race or have muscle atrophy and all those things. Sometimes we get dug in arguing, like with activity and rest, where we could make a case for why rest is great and healthy. We have all the research and everything to back it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have activity, right? And the same thing for activity. So early warning signs for particularly the group processes that you all are talking about, that's the time when you say to the person who's holding the other, we call these poles, activity and rest, that's holding the other side of the tension, what are you afraid of, right? So, we're trying to leverage, let's say, participative leadership and directive leadership and in a context where people have big concerns about directive leadership. And so the early warning signs where we ask someone, if you're holding the participant side and you're facilitating this process, and say, what are your fears about a more participative style of leadership? And people might say, I'm afraid that it'll be chaos, we won't get anything done or whatever. In this kind of process, you invite that. You say, well, I want to know exactly what we need to be afraid of, and then we're going to put it here on the map as an early warning sign. How would we know we've gone too far? So if you say, someone says, I'm worried that opening up our leadership process, right, will lead to chaos. You say, well, what would that look like? What's an early warning sign that we're in chaos? You just invite it, right? You want to know. And so you put it on the map. Like chaos might mean, we don't meet our goals, our quarterly goals anymore, right? Because we've opened this process up and there's so many voices, we're not getting anything done. So we put that there, and that's great because someone who's advocating for more participative leadership, they don't want the organization to become ineffective, right? No one wants that. And so we align with the resistance there, right? We say, okay, we both know that that's an early warning sign that it's gone too far. And same thing with the directive leadership. We'd say, okay, well, what's the downside of too much directive leadership? It might make people feel isolated. They feel like their creativity and their gifts can't be expressed. So we find an early warning sign. How would we begin to see that that's happening, right? Maybe it's a pulse survey that we're going to do once a month, or maybe it's some other sort of way of collecting some information. But then the map becomes the thing. We say, okay, we are taking these steps at the top, these action steps, and we're looking for these early warning signs. And if anyone sees the early warning signs, they can call us back together, right? They can call the community and call the group together and say, we agree that when we saw those things, we were going to readdress the action steps. And so that's why this thing is a living document. Like we're going to create one today, but it's not a static document. It's a dynamic way to manage the tension, right? To check in with people. How are we doing? Do we see any early warning signs? You can imagine training for a marathon, your action steps would change in the first part of your training than, a month before the marathon, a week before the marathon. You might change these action steps, early warning signs. So this is that kind of dynamic sort of thing. All right, I'm going to take a little bit of time with that because that's the core of what we're going to be doing together today. And just a note about assessment. So when we think about assessing attention, it's really about frequency. And I just want to use this slide to underline the point that, we're talking about an energy system, so there's not really a good or a bad. We're not really after balance. We're really after, you can see on the top, almost always. We want to almost always get the benefits of each side. That's what we're looking for when we think about assessing. So am I almost always getting, so take participatory and directive leadership. Now, in different organizations, I might have different quantity of those. But the way I assess it is, am I getting all the benefits of both? Am I getting the benefits of participative almost always, which is people feel heard, they feel included, there's voice. And am I getting the benefits of directive leadership, which is people maybe have a clear sense of where the boundaries are, they have a clear sense on the goals that the organization is being held accountable for. I want both those. So I ask, am I always getting those? And then we ask on the downsides, we hope that we're almost never getting the downsides of over-focusing on one to the neglect of the other. And so when we assess, we're thinking about, okay, how much of the downsides am I getting? So I might be getting a lot of the upsides and a lot of the downsides, right? And that tells me, okay, go back to the action steps, right? Tweak the action steps because something's gone wrong. But just, again, when the purpose of this is just think that we're not talking about good, bad, or done, not done. We're really talking about this dynamic nature. We want, and I mentioned in New Orleans, we want to be greedy for the upside. Like we want more of the upside. We get the upsides, we might be often getting the upsides, but we want to go beyond often, almost always getting the upsides of both and not getting the downsides. That's really what we're after when we're managing. Okay, so this is an example, like I mentioned with activity. It's possible that we're pushing hard. We're getting a lot of the upsides of activity, but we're starting to get the downsides too. And maybe with rest, we're not really getting much downside, but we're really not getting much upside. Maybe we're not optimizing our sleep patterns to prepare us for this, the amount of sleep that our body needs to prepare us for the marathon, right? So these can look all over the place. We don't want is this, which is this infinity loop showing basically a downward spiral. We're getting the downsides of both. It's possible to be in a situation where we're getting the downsides of both over time. If we overfocus on something like this, you can imagine you overfocus on activity, you get the downsides of activity, then you get injured, you get the downsides of rest, right? So part of the gift of the map is we start learning to see what does the loop look like, right? Even if we can't formally assess it, we start to think about what does this look like? Are we getting a lot of downsides, a lot of upsides? If we had to map it, what would it look like? We balance, why we say we're not after balance, because balance is, I'm getting, some of the upside, some of the downside. I don't really want any of the downside. I want all the upside. We want to be kind of greedy in that way. So this is what we're looking for. And just a reminder, this fluctuates over time, right? There's no perfection here of you just jump to, from the starting point to perfect leverage. It changes over time. We need to be dynamically assessing it. Can someone mute? Is that off mute? I don't know if you guys are hearing feedback, but I'm hearing a bunch of feedback. Okay, so I just wanted to put up some examples of polarities. I'll just give you a second to look through and I'll sort through some slides. I'd ask you to think about one you might want to play with today. If you don't have one or you have one, even if you have one, just take a look at these. We'll talk about it in a second, but just take a look and see if there's one that jumps out to you as relevant for your situation, one you might want to use. All right, let me show you a few more. These are some really typical ones. Okay, a few more. So short and long term, my big one there. We talked about directed participative, conditional respect, unconditional respect, continuity and change, similar to the one we worked in New Orleans. Part and whole is about, if I'm in a system, so my particular part may be a department, it might be part of the solution, and then the whole, right, how we work together is everywhere in almost every kind of group we're a part of, task and relationship. So we're going to go to the picking your tension that you want to work on, and we'll break into 2 breakout groups. Maren will be in one, I'll be in the other, kind of just there's a resource to help out. But any general questions or thoughts before we kind of start the working session? Wilson, we can't hear you.
Use turns and
Maybe you can type in the chat. I can't hear. Yeah, maybe you could chat the question. Okay, Wilson, there you go. You'll be back with sound. Okay.
Yeah, it seems like Wilson has a little bit of a lag.
Okay. Yeah. Wilson, if you want to chat it, we can get it. Anyone else have any questions or thoughts before we get into the working session? Okay, cool. All right, so since there are 4 of us, I think we can just work as a group of 1, and then the recording will be a little bit easier too. So what we're going to do, so we're going to grab a blank map. Hopefully you have it either electronically from the platform, from the link, or printed paper or a sheet of paper that you want to just draw on. I mean, like I said, we've used this on dirt floors, whiteboards, whatever. You can, don't worry about the format you have. So let's just take about 3 or 4 minutes to think, for just individually to think about. I showed you a list of some of the tensions. Think about which one you might want to use. And then we're going to start that kind of first part of the mapping with your map. So this is just an example, like support and accountability. We're going to do this part where you kind of fill in whatever tension you pick. You're going to fill in the upsides of both and the downsides. If we overdo one to the neglect of the other, just fill out that first part of the box.
Michael, we have a question in the chat box.
Okay, beautiful. Let me, actually, can you read it?
Yeah, so it says, Bobby was asking, can you show the filled out example for action and rest we could be inspired by?
Yes, okay.
Well, and Triana, I put that question in there like 2 seconds before you popped this up there, Michael. This is exactly what I was asking.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I think if I see this, then I know how to fill out mine. Thank you.
Perfect. Awesome.
Hey, Michael, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
In this example, I guess you would put it even in a context, right? You wouldn't just say like support, you would say accountability towards, like, I don't know, in the healthcare system or amongst your peers or in a project.
That's right. That's right. And sometimes it comes from the group, Wilson. So back to, to the questions about, meaning I've been in situations where people would say, the problem in our group process is we need more accountability. What polarity thinking for me takes me to is, okay, so let's talk about what that means, and the action steps kind of define what that means to us, right? So you could put a label on it, or you can generate it with the group. Like, so it's the group's initiating that and then saying, okay, well, accountability is connected with that is the idea of support. And what does that look like? And so even when you say that this is, you know, say on our team function or in our department, you really want the definitions to be meaningful to whoever's in the system with you.
Is there a right or wrong? Because I mean, naturally, I would think the opposing of accountability would be independence, or you know.
Beautiful question. Okay, so there's certainly not right, or there's certainly some things. So if you said, if someone said, okay, micromanagement and accountability, so that's wrong, because micromanagement for most of us is not a positive thing, right? So we want two things that are positive. So as long as the two things are positive and they fit together in the mind of the group, absolutely, right? You could have accountability and creativity, or you could have, you know, if for the group, that was something they were feeling a tension about, that some parts of my work or our experience together are pushing me toward accountability. Some parts are pushing me toward being more creative and being more that. Yeah. So this is the founder of the map, Barry Johnson, called it a language clarification tool. And it is really the dialogue that it helps you to have with the people who this is relevant to about what do we mean by these things. And so groups that could be in the same system might define this differently, the language slightly differently. And I always want to go, and their recommendation is to go with the language that's meaningful to whoever's in the system. Like whoever's in the room, who's going to commit to action steps and who's going to articulate early warning signs, whatever language makes sense to them, that's what you want to go with.
So do you ever have a situation where people, like in a group, they have difficulty coming up with a term where it's positive? Like I was thinking like mandatory. At first I wrote mandatory, but I'm like, I don't know too many contexts where mandatory is actually a good thing. You know, unless maybe it's like when you're flying a plane and you're the pilot.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. Yeah. So I'm thinking about my context in schools, right, where there were a lot of things that we were mandated to do. And to me, in that context, it is a good thing, meaning life safety things are mandated, and that's good, right? It's good that schools have to have adequate provision for children to get out of buildings quickly and have to have standards for food care. And I mean, those are all good things. Now, the proportion of mandatory to whatever you're putting on the other side, I may not want that to be 50-50, right? I may want mandatory to really be primarily about life safety and, you know, things that support equity of hiring and all, all of that is good. But in the actual, my experience, I may want that to be 10% of like my actual experience. And that's why we don't talk about balance here. We just, how much do I need of it to get the upsides, right? And the upsides of mandatory may be ensure that everyone has the basic needs met, ensure that, and we want those upsides. We don't want to go any further than that. We want to do the activity to get those upsides.
Right.
So Wilson, you start off, it's helpful. Why don't we just hear from others what tension you're thinking about, so we can just kind of refine them together.
Oh, you mean me or Bobby?
Oh yeah. So anyone who wants, you put mandatory on. You can either share the other side of what you're thinking about, or someone else.
Just because I felt that it was negative, I'm putting this in a medical context about doctors, and their influence on quality medical care. So I just put standardization on one side.
Nice.
And I put voluntary, but I just meant like, individual discretion.
Nice. Yeah. So you could say, standardization and flexibility. Sometimes what people talk about, standardization and individualization.
That's good. Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah. And for me, Wilson, I'm kind of looking at centralized and decentralized as a different version.
Yeah. Perfect. Jen?
So I'm so I've been looking at I think it's kind of a part versus whole thing
Mm.
where on the one hand it's the appeal of this campaign to the progressive left, and on the other hand the appeal of the campaign in a nonpartisan context, and kind of the whole of the polity. And I guess just to, I mean, I can start to talk through what I'm starting to populate this with, and then if you have other thoughts. So the kind of upside of kind of leaning more on this progressive left is really being able to be relevant to a currently energized base, whereas the upside of being more nonpartisan about it is really being able to bring some of these ideas into the mainstream and institutionalize them beyond political cycles. So some of the early warnings of or the downsides of kind of leaning more toward messaging for a progressive left is that moderates reject the ideas because they're seen as too liberal, and that we're starting to divide constituencies rather than bring them together. And some of the downsides of being more nonpartisan about it, maybe that people just like don't pick any of this up at all because it's seen as like kind of weak or abstract. And that, you know, even if people do pick up some of these participatory democracy practices, that they're not focused on equity because they're trying to kind of please a more moderate base.
Okay, no, that's super helpful. So, Jen, I think the question for me is the one poll that you're calling nonpartisan, is that, as I hear you describe it, I don't know if others have thoughts about is it nonpartisan, or is it that I have, like, on the one hand, I have the one appeals to the progressive wing of the party, and the other is mainstream appeal or something?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other? Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Jen.
No, I am kind of struggling a little bit with the labeling of it, because I mean we are beholden to be nonpartisan because we're getting grant funding, right? But I think functionally there are different audiences, and I think I'm trying to figure out if there are other words other than like mainstream, because that's well, one, I don't know who that is.
Yeah.
Right. And I know that these polls aren't, they're meant to be values, not people, right?
Yes.
But so I'm trying to figure out how to describe that sort of more inclusive umbrella in a way that is more descriptive.
Anyone have any other thoughts occur to them as we're talking about this? So, Jen, one other thing I like to think about is if I had a room, even though these polls aren't people, if I had a room where people were articulating these different perspectives, what language would they use? So if someone's making the case for the upsides that you were describing, that's in your organization or part of the group that you're reaching out to, what language would they use? If they said, "Oh, I'm afraid we'll go too far with the progressive politics," what would they say?
Wait, so sorry, the people who are
advocating for what you're calling the nonpartisan side, what language would they use?
I think they would use terms like bridging, or I think they'd use terms like unity. As upsides.
Okay, so Jen, as we go through the greater purpose, deeper fear, you'll have you might still come back and play with this, right? The greater purpose part might help clarify it, but I agree with you on the question of like the language on that right poll, but that's a great tension, right? Which is right, in any political process, we have, kind of strong minority, quote unquote, opinions that aren't of the opinion or perspective of the whole. And then there's kind of where the center of gravity is, or however we want to describe that. So I think that's, as a person who's trying to influence everybody, that makes a lot of sense that those are both kind of positive and you want the upside to both.
I don't think I have it yet, but I was wondering about something about, I was adding care for or attention to. So like back to your part whole where you started. So care for our progressive ideals and care for the whole society. So I'm not there yet, but I was wondering if that language might assist a bit.
All right. And part of what we're doing here is kind of modeling the process that, that you could do with others, right? It is really about, sometimes people want to rush to get the map done. This is really, the meat of it is really getting the language right. And right, not just in your head, but right in the head of everyone who's in the room, who's going to make commitments, that they would be nodding their head and say, yeah, that's a good description of what we're feeling here in this tension on what we should do. Kent, do you want to shout out what you're thinking as a tension you want to work with?
Sure. So I'm listening to everybody else, and it's kind of pieces of what everybody is saying, and I know I can't do that right now. For me, it was more so, I think it was, you have flexibility versus structure.
Yes.
And for me, that is, when I think of the water crisis and community really coming together to kind of, I guess, unify around solutions. The issue is, I guess the struggle is because the government was so, they really kind of took this dictatorship role with this water crisis and telling folk what they're going to do and what the solution was. And so that loss of democracy has made people want to make sure that we're always flexible and have voice. But sometimes when you stay in that flexible and have voice, at the next meeting, 19 other people come that wasn't there at the last meeting, so you lose your momentum. Then you're so flexible to where you may not get things done. And so I'm kind of stuck there on how to have this type of conversation on a community level so that folk can see that there has to still be a process, even in the flexibility. There has to be a process of how we still maintain momentum and not lose sight of the focus, because if not, we're going to just be flexible forever and nothing will get done. But yet you still understand why people are having issues, and want to make sure that there is that flexibility that encompasses community input and community voice. And so that's kind of where I am right now. And I haven't thought it all the way through because I'm listening to everybody else, and it's kind of giving me more clarity on how maybe to frame some of this. So I think that by the end of this session, I should have a little bit more clarity.
Awesome. Well, in what you're saying, Ken, I hear, again, not that this is right, just the language in my mind was kind of like inclusive and decisive, right? That you want an inclusive process for all the reasons you mentioned, and you need a decisive process. Decisions actually need to be made that don't get reopened every time. And how do you get the benefits of both of those, right?
Yeah,
and really put an and in the middle. We want all the benefits of the inclusive process and we want the benefits of the decisive process, and not make it an either or. Either we're gonna, like you said, either we're gonna just tell everyone what to do and it's decisive and not inclusive, or it's inclusive and not decisive. Yeah. So anyway, that's language you can noodle on. Okay, cool. You guys have great. This is perfect. Perfect meaty kind of tensions. So let's go to the next step, which is greater purpose and deeper fear. So what we're going to do is give you a little bit of individual time after I go through a slide, an example of a greater purpose. And I like to think about this as like, what's in it for you and others if this tension is managed well? So our simple example of the marathon, what's in it is you can compete in the marathon, right? That's, and then the deeper fear is if we don't manage it well, what happens, right? If we get in the downside. So in the marathon example, it's, well, we can't do the marathon. We get injured, those kind of things. There's a strong, greater purpose and deeper fear is worth its weight in gold. And the reason I say that is you all talked about in your context how passionate people feel about these different issues, right? And how they can be divisive. The greater purpose is really your opportunity to say, what is it that brings us together? So the way I think of criteria for greater purpose is the greater purpose is powerful. It's anchored in a deep motivation for everyone who matters, right? For you, for the team, or the organization, for the community. The greater purpose taps into something deep and strong. People are going to be willing, Kent, to your example just now, maybe if we're all clear the greater purpose, we might be willing to kind of give the other voice a little bit more room, right? Because we see what's common. And the deeper fear reflection of what something that everyone would want to fight to make sure it doesn't happen. So in my context, where I use this the most is in schools. Oftentimes we might be really divided on, teaching staff might be divided on, is it more important to teach basic fundamental skills that students can use to be more creative and innovative, or is it important to teach innovation, right? And people would get really divided on that. But what the opportunity to bring those people together is to say, what is it we want for kids? What do we want them to be able to do? And oftentimes then we're in total agreement about that. Right? We're arguing about how to get there. We have a lot of agreement. So this is a really powerful thing to identify together with a group, the greater purpose and deeper fear. So just in this same example of support and accountability that I was playing with, so here the greater purpose, is an engaged and accountable staff, right? So that was something that for this, in this context was really motivating. We wanted engagement and people wanted accountability. And then the deeper fear was the loss of good people. And so everyone, regardless of their preference here, was like having an engaged, accountable staff really matters, and not losing good people really matters, right? And so we're willing to do something so that we can get that. So we'll just take a couple of minutes with the tension that you just mentioned and think about what could be a greater purpose and what could be a deeper fear there. And then we'll have a little bit of conversation about it.
Mike, just a very quick question. I can't do it better than this beautiful graph, but I feel like when you said loss of good people, that resonated in terms of summarizing what, the greatest fear is.
Yeah.
The top one sort of just repeats the two polarities. So would you try to challenge the
yes
to come up with
yes, absolutely. And the top one, the engagement is the part. I agree with you about the accountable because it's kind of using one of the tensions in the greater purpose. You're right. Ideally, your greater purpose wouldn't mention any one of those two. So like engagement, an engaged faculty could be the top one, right? That then if I do these both well, people are engaged because they feel really supported and they're really clear on expectations.
Okay.
Yeah, great point. Okay, so just a couple minutes, greater purpose, deeper fear. So you may not all have been able to finish, but just so we can get through all the parts, let's check in. So I just, instead of us necessarily all sharing what we have, anyone kind of have any insights or questions that came as you started to think about this for your attention?
Well, for me, Michael, I had difficulty coming up with one thing. I could think of a lot of different phrases that maybe
Yeah.
and I thought maybe you don't need it, as long as people are, describing what is the goal or describing what is the dire consequence.
Yeah. So this is a great point. There are a lot of ways. I mean, even with what was the tension you were working with again, Wilson?
Yeah, I was working with like the tension between standardizing the work that
Yes.
I do and allowing individualism, which is actually linked to a lot of errors.
Yeah. So this is a super interesting one. Meaning, well, so you can go both ways, right? You could, in pulling people together who have the differences, if you feel like you have a good handle on a shared value, right? Sometimes as a communication tool, I'll use the greater purpose as even the reason why to try to bring people together who are experiencing the tension. And at the same time, sometimes it's more powerful to ask the group together, right? What's in it for us if we do this well? So, if you're in a medical context where you have people who really have a preference, because like we all have preferences in these tensions, have a preference for the individualization and really are afraid that the standardization is going to encroach upon that. At the same time, if we go up a level, everyone might agree we want optimal care for patients, right? So we want something to happen. We want to be known for a certain kind of quality of care. So sometimes it's powerful to then refine that together with the group and say, well, let's just remind ourselves, like, we're passionate about this because we care about this thing that we can agree on. But it works both ways. You can sometimes use it proactively, you have a sense of it, and you can also do it with the group, and that can be powerful as well.
Yeah. That's much what I had, on the downside. I thought, well, on the upside, I think doctors in this example would realize that the current practice is sort of jeopardizing much of what healthcare providers went into the business in the first place. So I wrote like the goal is like a earned status in the community as real health providers, as opposed to the opposite, where medicine's just a job, a paycheck, and it's the income is earned not necessarily through demonstrated quality.
Yeah. Nice. Great. Thank you, Wilson. Any other reflections, questions come up for you as you were doing this for your attention?
Michael, I had a question as I was looking at centralization and decentralization, and there's a whole bunch of issues I'm involved in right now that are dealing with that. But one is around managing wildfire smoke. So, for example, in Central or Southern Oregon, it's been identified as the #1 health issue, particular acute smoke exposure for folks who are working outside. And so the treatment is prescribed fire and forest restoration work, which creates kind of a background level of smoke and particulates, which is a problem for folks with chronic respiratory disease. So, the state has standardized air quality standards and health standards, but folks are trying to come up with regional solutions. And so I had a challenge on the greatest fear, because for me, the greatest fear is kind of how we make decisions paralyzes us from doing anything. And so for me, that felt like my greatest fear, because some people might be just totally cool hanging out and not doing anything.
Right.
But I could see people from managing the different sides of the polls could see that as a fear.
Yeah, I think that's, you're hitting on the question of are the health outcomes, the negative health outcomes, the deepest fear, right, for people on both sides of the tension? Maybe not, right? To your point, like, so for this to be powerful for the group, it has to be something that both people who are preferencing both sides of the tension would say, yeah, we really don't want that to happen. Yeah, and that can be hard to get to something, to get up. It's kind of like it's a level of abstraction up to where there is agreement, right? So, and sometimes that greater purpose and deeper fear for us, if we're in a facilitative role, for the group is different than what ours is, right? We might be in it for one reason, right? The group may coalesce around the economic well-being or something, right? And we may be like, that's not why I'm in it. But to manage the tension, you're really managing their passions, right? Not necessarily ours, if we're using a group process. Yeah. Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, let's go to the next piece and then we'll check back in. So let me do a little short introduction of some examples of action steps and early warning signs. And I'll talk about what's hard about it, and then we'll play with that with your attention. So action steps are what we need to get the upsides of, we're calling each pole of the tension, each side of it. And early warning signs are indicators of an overfocus on one to the neglect of the other. So in this example, we were doing with support and accountability. An action step for support might be conducting regular one-on-one meetings. This particular group was talking about being present in meetings, so cutting off technology, that sort of thing, and building coaching ability, because they had all been gotten some training around how to be a peer, kind of coach each other. So those were the action steps this group came up with. And then accountability, conducting regular one-on-one meetings. Now this is interesting, right? The action step appeared on both sides, and that happens sometimes. And that's what we call a high leverage move. So sometimes we find action steps that actually help with both. So you can imagine in a one-on-one meeting, I can both hear something that an employee needs, an area they need support, and I can also clarify how they're making progress toward their goals. So they have quarterly performance reviews, weekly performance feedback, kind of in the moment. So these were kind of, this group came up with as actions. So these are the things that make it real for support and accountability that we'll commit to. And this can be really helpful if in a group process to set up an expectation that once we come up with these, we're going to actually get back together and talk about it, right? So we're going to get back together in a month and 2 months and talk about how we're doing on these things. And then in this example, early warning signs can be hard. So you can see here, they said, well, if we over-focus on support to the neglect of accountability, maybe high performance ratings that people are getting don't correlate with the direct feedback that they're actually getting. So maybe there's grade inflation, right, going on in ratings because people are trying to be supportive, over-focusing on supportive. Maybe there are issues being pushed to people who are in charge, right, because peers aren't telling each other, hey, you did this and it had an impact on me and we need to make some adjustments. Increasing complaints that others aren't doing their job. So again, these for this particular group meant something, right? They might not mean as much in my context, but together they came up with these. And really, I gave the example before, if you're facilitating this, you want to ask the people with the preference on accountability in particular, what are the early warning signs that we've gone too far in the other direction? Or you want to use that resistance. You want to use the difference here. So same thing on the other side, early warning signs of over-focus on accountability. Pulse surveys indicate people not feeling the freedom to take risks. So that's concrete, it's measurable. Increased time on personnel issues, complaints about fairness. So this, for that group, that's how we're going to know. So you can see from an example like this, if that group got back together in 2 months or 3 months, they could have a sense of this. They could have a sense of whether the action steps are happening, a sense of Are any of these early warning signs getting triggered? And if so, they can change the action steps, right? It's not a good, bad thing. It's about that dynamic sense of, all right, what are the next steps? What are the next early warning signs? So let's just do the same process. After I'll ask if there are any questions, and after that, you can start working on action steps and early warning signs for your attention. And just we'll take a couple minutes. If you're done before that, you can shoot me a message in the chat. But any questions on action steps, early warning signs before we go into our individual work? All good. Okay, so let's do it. Shoot me up on the chat when you're ready to, a stopping point. I'll probably cut you off before you get there, but if you do, let me know. Let's check back in, and I want to check it back in with you and see any questions, new insights come up for you in thinking about action steps and early warning signs.
So Michael, for me, as I was putting in some of the kind of the indicators and early warning signs, I found that some were the same indicator applied for both poles. That's cool, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. What's an example, Bobby, just so we get an idea?
So for centralized and decentralized, one might be kind of the inability to report on the impact of the work. And so if you're too centralized, we may not have an accurate sense. If we're too decentralized, we may not have a cohesive sense.
Yeah. And I like those differences. I would use the difference in, in one case, we might not have a complete sense. In one case, we might, to capture, the thing about the early warning sign, the more specific we can be, and if you were doing it with a group, you could actually define what is complete. So complete, is it like every county reporting in the same sort of metrics, right? Using the same measures. And then, if it was, let's say with centralized, it was too narrow, right? The data set, right? So then if that's the issue, then we want to try to define what is too narrow, right? That we might only have the minimum amount of data for everyone, right? And we miss the data we actually need for decision making. But that's where really in the group process, you want to spend the time really digging into those early warning signs. So it's as much as possible so that it's really clear when we get back together if we over-focused. And it's hard. Sometimes it takes the most work is getting those early warning signs to something that's early. Because a lot of times the signs that are more available to us are the late warning signs, right? Like, Wilson, your example where, they're quality indicators of patients being affected. Well, that's late. We would love to get a warning sign way before that. And sometimes with the group, we actually have to try to come up with new ways, new measures to capture something early, because a lot of our measures are designed to capture the failure, not to capture kind of what happens before the failure. So thanks for sharing that example. Jen, I wanted to loop back with you and see if this, back to where we were in the process, see if the last two steps had changed at all, kind of anything about, or gave you any insight into the tension you were describing to us.
Yeah. So the kind of focus, achievement, and worst fear was helpful. And I think I had a strong worst fear that I think on both sides, there's a fear of irrelevance. Like on both sides, whether they're trying to be more focused on a progressive base or whether they're trying to reach a wider base. I think there's agreement on that being the worst fear. Yeah. I think everyone's kind of striving for some version of ubiquity or prevalence. Just different thoughts on how to get there. Yeah. I think I was, to what you were just saying about the early warning signs really being early, I think I'm struggling with that. I had a similar experience to Bobby where my early warnings on both sides look very similar. But I think they're mostly actually kind of like medium or long-term outcomes of this campaign that we're working on.
Yeah.
So I can kind of read them off and see if
Yeah.
we can generate some things that feel a little bit earlier. So
Good.
I think one across the board would be that organizations won't sign on to this kind of platform or policy. You know, if we go too far
Yeah.
on the progressive side, that, you know, mainstream organizations won't.
Yeah.
And I think on the more on the mainstream or full polity side, that like few, if any, organizations that have a real base will sign on. It'll be kind of, you know, the folks who play nice but don't actually have a following. Right. I think
Yeah.
on both sides, like I could see some of the practices that we're promoting being used as kind of a progressive purity test, and that being problematic on both sides. And this is a very, very late indicator that the initial pilot commitments that come out as a result of adopting this platform either have very limited reach, or that they you know, they only kind of reach a certain kind of usual suspects who are already kind of sold by these values, or that the pilot is like really weak and doesn't really advance equity because people are afraid of being controversial or whatever. So those are all signs, I think, that we've gone too far in either direction, but different flavors of it. But again, they all feel like very late indicators to me.
Yeah. Oh, this is a great one. So I'll share my thoughts and see if Wilson or Marin have any other thoughts. I think so. Part of what could be an interesting discussion would be: are there key organizations that, you know, maybe from a strategic perspective, you think, okay, if we don't have these organizations, we have a big problem, right? So sometimes the early part might be, I have representative organizations that, if I can get a read from them, I actually have a hypothesis, right, that, you know, larger groups follow them, right? So are there influencers that might be a way to do the early part? But it's very tricky because public opinion and sentiment can be moved, right? So it can be moved over time. So I think, but I think it would be really helpful for everyone to get clear, to actually articulate and probably argue about, you know, what are some of the most influential parts of both the progressive community and the mainstream community that we care about, and how can we watch that as a representative for us of whether we need to come back together. And that information could be gathered even more directly with those groups, right? If we have a theory about who they influence. So that was the one thought that came to my mind about early, because it's a social network, right? And people are influencing other people. So could you go kind of up the influence chain? But any other, Wilson, Marin, you guys have any other thoughts about how you might get early in this example?
Not on that issue. I found that at least in my example, it was sort of fun. You know, I had standardization and individualization, and of course, like everyone wants to be individual, right? Especially in hierarchy and all that kind of stuff. But so in looking at the action steps for standardization, this is why I didn't do that early. I was actually talking about like standardization of like protocols, how we treat disease, so to prevent those, you know, those things that you're talking about, and you know, it can involve those doctors, et cetera. But it was sort of fun for the action steps for the individualization. I realized that it's not that doctors don't care that they want to act like individuals as a doctor, as long as that you could replace that need somewhere else. So for example, I thought examples of individualization were like they could have, you know, be in charge of reviewing the results they wanted, you know, and then showing that and showcasing that. You know, you could give awards to people. They could lead, you know, quality committees. They could, you know, whereas before they were all very granular about what they do. The higher purpose is to you know, achieve a greater result by the system, but they can be actors.
Um,
Anyway, that was sort of fun for me, but I didn't want to take away with what you were discussing, you know, about these
yeah.
indicators. I just, it wasn't applicable to my example. It wasn't as applicable.
Cool.
I think both of these examples are awesome and really helpful. Jennifer, when I was listening to you and Michael, I agree. I just kept thinking about how connected the action steps and the early warning signs are potentially for your specific polarity map, and because you're really trying to gauge, you know, how are people responding to messaging and you know, to the work that you're actually doing. And so I was thinking, what are the action steps that would give you the early warning signs or those early indicators? So I was trying to think of, you know, different ways you might be pulling a subset of each poll to see, you know, how is this messaging landing? And that might be an action step. And then an early warning sign would be, we would start to see, you know, negative reactions or, you know, maybe even specific questions in there that you'd be asking. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I was agreeing with Michael that the feedback loop for you, any way you could create an earlier feedback loop, that might be helpful.
What's funny I'm sorry, I think I got the terminology mixed up because we all have those early signs for everything that, you know, we kind of do. But in mine, the early signs were just the signs, like the current signs. You know, like the system is so polarized downwards that the early warning signs are already there. Does that make any sense? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, like, you know, for standardization, you know, the bad thing is that, like, people would, you know, the early warning sign is that people just feel like they work in a bureaucracy, you know, they're just a cog in the larger wheel, but they already feel like that. It just would be, you know, a little bit more, I guess, extreme, I guess. Same with the individualization. They would feel like business as usual. They would, yeah, they would just, again, feel, I would say, between, oh yeah, there would be poor quality care. They would, you know, sort of, the doctors would be taking credit for health that they weren't a part of, and at least in this example, they're sort of in it. Right? So it was sort of interesting to realize that the early warning signs are actually the current signs.
Yeah, so that's great. So let me build on for both of you. I kind of what Maureen said, and we're at 5, so this will be our. We need to close here, but I think, Wilson, your point there, it's really with the group that you would say. So, how are we going to assess how people are feeling, right? And what does moving the needle mean? So, people are feeling like wheels in a cog. For the early warning sign, part of it is we need to create a sign. So maybe we need a survey or we need a text vote or something that we ask people to literally, we're going to collect that data because we're going to commit to action steps that we think are going to change that. And we need a way to know. So that's an example where the reality might be existing, right? It's happening in conversation every day, but we actually don't have the data yet, or a way to capture the data. And it could be informal, it could be hands raised in a meeting, it could be whatever, but that we're actually going to do some things and then, you know, and then see what happens. So Jen, I see you're about to sign off. So same thing, more we can do this with a group, the more we can be specific. Thank you all for joining us. Everyone who's listening after the fact. A lot of fun. Wilson, feel free to chat if there's any other things that we can be helpful with, or email. But thanks so much for being a part and lasting till the end in particular.
No, thank you very much. It was great to actually have this review because I remember